Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 132nd deck and it's titled 3 Goblins in a Trench Coat. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card was suggested to us by Albert Keltenbach. I apologize if I mispronounced that, over on YouTube. And it is going to actually be Muxus Goblin Grandee. So Muxus is 4 red for a 4/4 Goblin Noble. When Muxus Goblin Grandee enters the battlefield, reveal the top 6 cards of your library. Put all Goblin creature cards with converted mana cost 5 or less from among them onto the battlefield, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Then, whenever Muxus attacks, it gets +1/+1 until the end of turn for each other goblin you control. So, an unspoken rule on this channel is that if we have a legendary creature as our random card of the week, we do have to make that legendary creature the commander because it just makes the most sense if we're building around that card. So obviously, we are going to be playing Muxus in the command zone this week. That means we are mono red and technically also goblins, but there is a bit of a twist to that, which I will explain in just a second, because I think we need to take a look at some of our themes to figure out what this deck is actually doing. So our first theme this week is, as I kind of already mentioned, it is going to be goblins, but more specifically, it's actually going to be legendary goblins. Some of the way that goblins work is that they tend to have a lot of support for most Magic sets and of just kind of random things that are happening. Goblins are always usually around. So one of the nice things about that is that not only do we get a ton of goblins, but we get a ton of legendary goblins in particular. And I figured I didn't want to build a traditional Muxus just goblins deck. I wanted to find some way to make it unique, and so therefore I decided to go with the legendary goblins. And in this case, to represent that, we have Pashalik Mons, which is 2 and a red for a 2/2 Goblin Warrior, of course, legendary creature. Whenever Pashalik Mons or another goblin you control dies, Pashalik Mons deals 1 damage to any target. Then you can pay 3 and a red, sacrifice a goblin, and create 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens. So if we are playing a bunch of legendary goblins, it then only makes sense that for our next theme, we're leaning into the Legendary Matters sub-theme. And a great example of that is Rising of the Day, which is 2 and a red for an enchantment. Creatures you control have haste, and legendary creatures you control get +1/+0. Now, I'm going to be perfectly honest before we get too much further into this. You will see a lot of Lord of the Rings cards in here for a couple of reasons. One, it brought us quite a few legendary goblins, which is great, but it also brought us a lot of legendary support in red, which isn't something we've had a ton of in the past. So there are a lot of Lord of the Rings cards in here because they actually support both of our themes very, very well. And Rising of the Day is an absolutely perfect card for this deck. It's great that we get haste because we want to be aggressive, and it's great that we're pumping up our team because most of our team is going to be legendary creatures. But all of that is going to lead us into our third and final theme for the deck, which is simply just goblins. We can build an entire deck of just legendary goblins, but there's not a ton of synergies between them all, other than, of course, just making more goblins. So we do need to find a way to get a little bit of advantage from our goblins. And a big way we're going to do that is with Lord effects, giving them +1/+1, and card draw. And lucky for us, Runevelt Hordemaster is actually both. Runevelt Hordemaster is 1 and a red for a 1/1 Goblin Warrior. Other goblins you control get +1/+1. Whenever Runevelt Hordemaster or another goblin you control dies, exile the top card of your library. If it's a goblin creature card, you may cast that card until the end of your next turn. So I very much could have put Runevelt Hordemaster into the key cards section of this deck tech because it's very impressive with all that it does. It's a 2 mana Lord effect. It gives +1/+1, but it's also card draw. It's also, in a way, board wipe protection because we can cast those cards until the end of our next turn. So if all of a sudden we have a huge board and our board gets wiped, we still have the Hordemaster to come back from that. So that can be very impressive and very useful. But as you'll notice, Runevelt Hordemaster is not a legendary creature. So of course, we gotta have some synergies with the goblins that are beyond just legendary. Gotta tie everything together, right? So anyway, moving on to our key cards for this deck, we have a couple of things that are going to be very important to us. The first of which is going to be Moria Marauder. Card draw is incredibly relevant for this deck. And Moria Marauder is going to be a great way to get that, because it is red for a 1/1 Goblin Warrior, has double strike. Whenever a Goblin or Orc you control deals combat damage to a player, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. Now, this isn't quite as effective as the Horde Master because it doesn't say we can play it until the end of our next turn, so we really want to make sure that we're attacking and then casting any spells and even playing our lands, because we can play lands with the Marauder. And since it has double strike, we'll get 2 triggers from it alone. But the most important thing about this card is that it doesn't say non-token. If we fill our board with a ton of little token goblins, we can then just essentially draw, even though we're not officially drawing, a bunch of cards. And that can be a great way to refill our hand, technically. Again, not actually card draw, but refill our hand in a way, be able to refill our board just in case, and keep putting threats out into play. So Moria Marauder really does a lot of great things, and it comes down very early. You can get it down as early as turn 2, and then just start swinging for the rest of the game. Typically, no one's going to want to block it because of the double strike, and obviously it's going to trade up with some things if they're 2/2s. So very relevant as a card in the deck. Next up for our key cards, we have Éomer, Marshal of Rohan. See, I told you, lots of Lord of the Rings. So Éomer, 2 red for a 4/4 human knight. He's got haste. Yes, I know, he is not a goblin. It's okay. He is a friend of the goblins. Maybe not lore-wise, but in this deck, he is a big fan of the goblins, because whenever one or more other attacking legendary creatures you control die, untap all creatures you control. After this phase, there's an additional combat phase. This ability triggers only once each turn. Now, it is a bit of a shame that it only triggers once each turn, but this is a 4/4 for 4 that has haste that can also give us additional combat steps every single turn. And we really don't need that many additional combat steps to be able to close out the game. And if we're attacking with a ton of legendary creatures, there's a good chance that our opponents are going to be stuck in a very difficult situation, because they can either block one of the legendary creatures and kill it, giving us an extra combat step, or they could not block it and just take the damage. Either way, we're kind of winning, because we either get to attack again or we get to keep our creatures, both of which perfectly fine by us. And moving into our last key card, we have Krenko, Mob Boss. Of course, we cannot build a legendary goblin deck without good old Krenko, because Krenko is 2 red for a 3/3 legendary creature goblin warrior, and it taps to put X 1/1 red goblin creature tokens onto the battlefield, where X is the number of goblins you control. So Krenko, definitely a massive threat when it comes to board development, because even on his own, if he's the only goblin in play, he'll tap, he'll make 1 other goblin, then the next turn he'll tap to make 2, then 4, then 8, and it can very quickly get out of hand, because we're also going to be doing other things at the same time. If we have something like Runeveld Hordemaster and we've filled up our board with a bunch of 1/1s like Krenko is making, they're now 2/2s and they draw us cards when they die. Éomer means that if someone kills Krenko, we just get to, take an extra combat step, I guess, assuming we're attacking with Krenko. I would imagine we're not, but you never know. And then Moria Marauder is going to turn each of those little goblins into more card draw. So Krenko really is the MVP of the deck, because nothing in the deck can churn out tokens quite the way that he does. So not only is he a goblin, not only is he legendary, he also is one of the best token generators we have. And I think that definitely earns him a spot here in our key cards. But with all of that out of the way, let's move into our cool interactions in this deck and talk about some cards that I think either synergize very well together or are just cards that I kind of want to talk about. So the first of our cool interactions is going to be between Delina, Wild Mage, and Ardaz, Cobbler of War. So Delina is, once again, not a goblin, but we'll say she's a friend to the goblins. She is 3 and a red for a legendary creature, Elf Shaman, 3/2. Whenever Delina Wild Mage attacks, choose target creature you control, then roll a d20. 1 through 14, create a tapped and attacking token that's a copy of that creature, except it's not legendary, and it has exile this creature at the end of combat. 15 through 20, create one of those tokens and roll again. So worst case scenario, we attack with Delina and we get a copy of one other creature. The most important part of Delina is that it makes a non-legendary copy, which means we can in fact copy our legendary creatures. And one of the best creatures to copy is Ardaz's Cobbler of War, which is 1 and a red for a 1/1 legendary creature, Goblin Shaman. Haste, whenever Ardaz's Cobbler of War or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, that creature gets +2/+0 until the end of turn. Then you can pay 3 and a red, create a 1/1 red goblin creature token with haste, activate only as a sorcery. Now, this is where things get a little bit tricky. So if Ardaz comes in, she becomes a 2 mana 3/1 with haste, which is already pretty decent. But if we attack with Ardaz and Delina, and we copy Ardaz, again, we're just talking worst case scenario, we copy Ardaz once. The second copy is going to come in, and it is going to get +2/+0 from itself, and +2/+0 from the original Ardaz, making it a 5/1 with haste. And that is if we only get one. And that's not on top of the fact that every other creature we make that turn, well, I say that turn, until the end of combat, that's how long we got the second Ardaz for, that creature is going to come in with +4/+0 as well, because it's going to trigger both of the Ardazes. Ardazai? I have no idea what the plural for Ardaz is. I'm sure someone knows, or maybe not, because it is technically a made-up word. But if we then swing in, we make 2 Ardaz, or we make our original plus a copy, and then we make a ton of additional goblins. Maybe it's something like Battlecry Goblin, or we have creatures that make goblins when they attack. All of that stuff is going to trigger, and we can stack it in a way that Ardaz resolves first. We make all of those token copies, and then everything else comes in. So even just our 1/1 goblins are now 5/1 goblins, and that presents a massive threat very, very quickly. And if our opponents don't have little chump blockers, there's nothing they can really do about it. So I think I've talked about this combination enough. I'm a big fan of this, and honestly, looking at this has made me want to do something with Ardaz in the future. I don't know quite what, but I'm sure you all are aware at this point, Delina is one of my favorite cards. I put it in so many decks because it's just that good. So if you're interested in Delina, I would recommend picking her up because her price is just slowly rising over time. She used to be a bulk rare, now she's almost $2, so that is something to keep in mind. But let's move on to our next cool interaction, which is going to look very different than this first one because it's going to be between Helm of the Host and Kiki Jiki. So I guess in a way it's similar because we are still making tokens, but this one is just a flat out win the game combo because we're going to take the Helm of the Host, which is 4 mana for a legendary artifact equipment. At the beginning of combat on your turn, create a token that's a copy of equipped creature, except the token isn't legendary. If equipped creature is legendary, that token gains haste. Equip for 5. Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker is 2 red for a 2/2 legendary creature, Goblin Shaman. He's got haste. And tap, put a token that's a copy of target non-legendary creature you control onto the battlefield. That token has haste. Sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. There's a couple of key features to this combination. The first is that if we equip Kiki Jiki with Helm of the Host and then move to combat, we make a non-legendary version of Kiki Jiki. It has haste naturally, but it also gets haste from Helm of the Host, but we don't want to attack with it, because if we attack with it, it's tapped and we can no longer use its ability. We could, at that point, tap the token copy of Kiki Jiki, which is non-legendary, or the original Kiki Jiki, to make another copy of the non-legendary Kiki Jiki, which the new one can come in with haste to make another copy, and then another copy, and then another, and so on, and we can make infinite Kiki Jikis. The problem here is that all of these Kiki Jikis are now tapped, and they're going to have to be sacrificed at the beginning of the next end step. So we've essentially just proven to our opponents that we have an infinite combo that does literally nothing. Except, if we go to the end of our opponent's turn, we can then do that exact same thing and make an infinite number of tapped Kiki Jikis, but because we are in our opponent's end step, and the Kiki-Jiki tokens sacrifice at the beginning of the next end step, we actually get to untap with an infinite number of Kiki-Jikis, which will be sacrificed at the end of our turn instead. And that is where the combo comes in, because now we just have infinite 2/2s that can all just swing in and knock everyone else out of the game. Obviously, there are ways to get around this. If someone has a ghostly prison, for example, we can't pay for all of that. But this is still a game-winning combo, provided nobody has any way to stop it. And I think that's worth mentioning, especially because while these two cards are very expensive in the deck, they're not the most expensive cards, especially Kiki-Jiki. I remember him being a lot more expensive, so I'm very happy to get to play with him in this deck. I think it's relevant that they're both very good in this deck no matter what. Kiki-Jiki a little less so because you can only copy non-legendary creatures, and we do have a ton of legends, but Helm of the Host helps us get around that by turning our legends into non-legends. So a little bit of a non-bow with our legend synergies, but I think it's worth it in the end. So let me know in the comments what you think. Is this something that is worth including in the deck? I know it's kind of slow. It's 4 mana for Helm of the Host, 5 mana for Kiki, 5 mana to equip, so it's not like we don't telegraph this interaction. But anyway, once again, I think that's enough rambling from me. So let's move on to the actual price of this deck, the thing that I know everybody is waiting to hear about. And this week, our total deck price came out to $97.91. And you might be wondering what the most expensive card is, because we just talked about Helm of the Host, which is about $7.30. And the most expensive card is very close to that. It's Mithril Coat at $7.46, so just barely beating out Helm of the Host. But Mithril Coat also really deserves a spot in the key card section, and if it hadn't been the most expensive card, I was going to put it in there. Because Mithril Coat, 3 mana for a legendary artifact, equipment, has Flash, Indestructible, and when it enters the battlefield, attach it to target legendary creature you control. Equipped creature has Indestructible, and equip for 3. So Mithril Coat is a great way to make sure that our opponents can't just destroy our creatures whenever they want. We can flash it in, protect it. But then we can also put it on cards that are very important to our game plan. We can make sure that Muxus has it so he can't die. We can make sure that Ardaz has it because she's a 1/1. We can make sure that Delina has it so she can swing and not worry about whatever else might kill her on the battlefield. So Mithril Coat really does everything we want it to do, because it cares about automatically equipping to a legend. And since we have so many legends that are important to our game plan, it really makes sense that this is in the deck. So if you do have to cut a card for budget purposes, you can cut Mithril Coat. There are other ways to give Indestructible, but unfortunately most of those ways are not in red, and this is, as far as I'm aware, the cheapest Indestructible equipment in mono red. So that is unfortunately a price you may have to pay, but if you don't really care too much, if you're going to add in maybe some other legendary goblins or something, you can cut it to trim the price of the deck down just a little bit. On the other hand, though, if you're actually looking to increase the price of the deck and or put in some cards that I think would work very well, but we didn't have room for in the budget, I do have a card to suggest for you there as well. And the card this week that I would recommend putting in, if you're able to afford it, is Purphoros, God of the Forge. And I know that that is a very expected include, but I'll explain that. And then the card that I would take out is Slowbad Iron Golem. So, I'm sorry, not Slowbad Iron Golem, I'm sorry, Slowbad Iron Goblin, very different. Golems and goblins are not the same thing, even though apparently my brain thinks that they are. But anyway, Purphoros, God of the Forge, is 3 and a red for a 6/5 legendary enchantment creature god. He has Indestructible. As long as your devotion to red is less than 5, Purphoros isn't a creature. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Purphoros deals 2 damage to each opponent, and 2 in a red, creatures you control get +1/+0 until the end of turn. Now, Purphoros is a massive $11.54, so obviously he does not fit into our budget. However, if you're looking for win conditions that are not just combat, Purphoros is the way to go, because now we get to do 2 damage to each opponent whenever a goblin enters the battlefield, and we have a ton of ways to make goblin tokens. We talked about Krenko earlier. If Krenko taps and makes, say, 10 goblins, that's 20 damage to each opponent. There's not much our opponents are going to be able to do at that point, especially because we just made 10 goblins that most likely have haste, and then we can use Perforos to give them +1/+0. So we really can close out games very, very quickly with Perforos, which is why I think he's a great inclusion. On the other hand, if you do have to take a card out of this deck, I would recommend Slowbad Iron Goblin, said it right this time, which is 2 and a red for a 3/3 legendary creature Phyrexian Goblin Artificer, and Slowbad can tap to sacrifice an artifact, then add an amount of red equal to the sacrificed artifact's mana value, spend this mana only to cast artifact spells or activate abilities of artifacts. If we're being perfectly honest, we really don't have a ton of artifacts. So Slowbad doesn't work quite as well as he would like. There are other decks where he's going to probably be the MVP, very, very impressive, but this unfortunately is not that deck. Like I said, we have a couple of artifacts. We've talked about a few of them like Helm of the Host and the Mithril Coat, but those aren't really artifacts we want to be sacrificing, and the odds of us being able to sacrifice an artifact to then cast another artifact, relatively slim. Slowbad's really only in here because he is a legendary goblin, plus he's a 3/3 for 3, which isn't terrible. So if you do want to upgrade the deck, I would recommend swapping out Slowbad and putting in Perforos. I do think that would make the deck run a little bit smoother and be a little bit more efficient. But that is the only out-of-budget upgrade I have for this week. And so obviously, we've talked a lot about this deck, but we got to see how it performs in a game. However, before we get to that point, I do want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel, help reach out to us, and, as always, if you have suggestions for cards you would like to see turned into decks, these are all great ways to make sure that I know about that. So starting off at the top, we've got Twitter. You can find us at 13POYNZ. Reddit, you can find us at u/POYNZ13, and you can send us an email, dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. I try my best to post as many updates as I can across all of these platforms, and so if you ever have any questions about what's going on with the channel, if you ever just want to chat, these are all great ways to reach out. If you're looking to support the channel, you can find us over on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, and right here on YouTube as a channel member. Both of those are great ways to help support the channel, and I try to give back as much as I can to our patrons and channel members because I try to make sure that you get the guarantee from me that any of your suggestions will be turned into decks for the channel eventually. Like I said, I will try to do my best to get to everybody's, but I can't promise to get to it unless you are a patron or a channel member, so priority does go to them. But alongside that, you also get access to a Discord channel where we brew up a lot of the decks, and also it's the first place I look for games. So if you're looking to participate in some of the games on this channel, that is a great way to do that. You'll also get access to the unedited gameplay videos. You'll get access to a card sent to you every single month as a thank you for all of your support. And then, maybe most importantly, you get to see the deck lists an entire week early. So I've had quite a few times where my patrons have caught some mistakes I've made with the decks, maybe putting in some cards that weren't viable with a companion we might have had or something like that. So I really do lean on my patrons and channel members to catch some of my mistakes because I do make them. I am human. And if none of these are things that you either want to do or are capable of doing, I completely understand. I understand it's not for everyone. So if you could just like the video and subscribe to the channel, that does help out just as much. So thank you to everyone for all of your support. And of course, we got to shout out our patrons and channel members before we move on. So a big thank you to William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Hui, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Devin Purser, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, and Patty Whack. To the 11 of you, thank you all so much for all of your support, and if you would like your name read out loud with all of them, check out our Patreon and channel membership. But I think that is enough of the self-plugging, so let's move into the actual game and see how our Muxus deck can perform against some opponents. So our opponents this week, we're going to be joined by Shawn playing Gork, His Infinite Sorrow, Jason playing Elrond, Master of Healing, and Bilal playing Rowan, Scion of War. Now you may be thinking to yourself, looking at Shawn's commander, that doesn't look like a commander I've ever seen before. And you would be 100% correct. So Shawn actually helped design a lot of his own cards. He was able to find different websites and things that helped him build it, like put it together so he could get the mana costs in there, the artwork, the flavor text, all of that. But he did come up with quite a lot of this on his own. And so a lot of what we're going to see from his deck, well, I say a lot, it's actually 100% other than the basic lands, are going to be cards that were specifically designed by him for this deck. So I'm going to do my best to read out every single card as it shows up. I am also going to be putting the entire deck list of all the cards that he made down in the description of the video. So if you are interested, please do check that out. He ran a lot of them through our Discord to make sure that none of them were going to be too overpowered or didn't break the color pie too much. And you might see on the lists that I post that there are some cards that are slightly out of date with some of the things that he played. We might have added a mana cost somewhere along the line or changed the formatting just to make sure that it worked right. But I know he would appreciate this, so if you are interested in this at all, please do check out that deck list, and you can send me any of the suggestions you have or anything you think might need to be tweaked or fixed, or just put them in the comments. I know he would appreciate a lot of the feedback, and honestly, I am also very interested. A lot of our Discord members are very invested in this deck at this point, so let me know what you think. Overall, though, that deck is kind of a graveyard deck. He wanted to focus on casting non-creatures in Golgari, which is a very unique thing, and then also caring about the cards that go into or out of his graveyard. Moving on, though, talking about Jason's Elrond deck, this is kind of Jason's, I don't want to say specialty, because I think his specialty is probably in Aristocrats, but his second specialty is definitely scrying. He loves to scry cards. He's decided that that is one of his go-tos. He's got several decks built around it at this point, which is awesome. He's very good at it. So I am very scared of the Elrond deck because I know that Jason can do quite a bit with a lot of card advantage, and being able to scry and still get things on top of it is very, very powerful. And then last but not least, we have Bilal and his Rowan Scion of War deck. This is probably the deck that I'm the most concerned about at the table. Rowan is just absolutely busted if you can get the right cards, especially in Rakdos. Being able to lose life is very, very simple, and there's a lot of spells that are relatively fair and balanced because they cost so much mana. So for Rowan to reduce the cost of those makes this a very scary deck, especially because I know Bilal has a little bit of a tendency to lean toward combo, and I have no doubt there are ways to combo with Rowan. So as excited as I am to see this deck, I am also very scared of it. But let me know in the comments which of these cards you think might be the most difficult for our deck to take down, and or if you have any suggestions for Shawn's Gork deck, like I said earlier. But with all of that being said, I think it's time to see how our deck does, so let's jump into this game, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Shawn, Jason, and then Bilal. On my first turn, I play an Autonomous Furnace. Shawn plays a Swamp. Jason plays a Forest, then casts Sentinel Totem, scrying 1 when it enters and letting him sacrifice it to exile all graveyards. Bilal plays a Blackcleave Cliffs. I play a Mountain, then cast Arcane Signet. Shawn plays a Forest and casts the Heart of Gork, which is an artifact that can tap for colorless mana, or let him pay 5 mana to tap it and draw a card. Jason plays a Vine Glimmer Snarl, revealing a forest so that it comes into play untapped, then casts Priests of Titania, which can tap for green mana equal to the number of elves in play. Bilal plays a Mountain and casts Mere Convert, which taps for a mana of any color at the cost of 2 life. I cast Krenko Tin Street Kingpin, putting a +1/+1 counter on him when he attacks, then making a number of 1/1 Goblin tokens equal to his power. Shawn plays a Swamp and casts the Guards of Silence, putting a +1/+1 counter on each creature he controls whenever it or another black creature enters the battlefield under his control. Jason plays a Forest and casts his commander, Elrond, Master of Healing, letting him put a +1/+1 counter on up to X target creatures, where X is the number of cards he looks at whenever he scries. Then he also gets to draw a card whenever a creature he controls with a counter on it becomes the target of a spell or ability that an opponent controls. Bilal plays a Dragon Skull Summit and casts his commander, Rowan Scion of War, which can be tapped to make his black and red spells cost X less to cast, where X is the amount of life he's lost this turn. I play a Mobilized District and attack Shawn with Krenko, putting a +1/+1 counter on him, making 2 Goblin tokens, and then doing 2 damage to Shawn. In my second main phase, I cast Goro Goro, Disciple of Ryusei, and Battlecry Goblin. Shawn plays a Forest and casts his commander, Gork, his Infinite Sorrow, allowing him to pay a mana whenever he casts a non-creature spell to do damage to any target equal to the spell's mana value, and also do 1 damage to Gork. This also triggers his guards, putting a +1/+1 counter on all of his creatures. Jason plays an island and casts Farhaven Elf, searching his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. He then also casts Elvish Mariner, letting him scry 1 when it attacks, and also tap X non-land permanents, where X is the number of cards he looks at whenever he scries. Bilal plays a mountain and taps Mere Convert, paying 2 life, then activates Rowan, making all his red and black spells cost 2 less this turn since he's lost 2 life. This lets him cast Descent into Avernus, which gets 2 counters in his upkeep, then does damage to each player equal to the number of counters on it, and also lets each player make that many treasure tokens. Then he also casts Kalain Reclusive Painter, making a treasure token when they enter, and also letting any other creature he casts enter with a number of +1/+1 counters equal to the mana from treasures spent to cast it. On my turn, I cast Hobgoblin Bandit Lord, giving all my other goblins +1/+1. I then attack Bilal with Battlecry Goblin, creating a 1/1 Goblin token that is also attacking Bilal since I attacked with at least 6 power. Then I also attack Shawn with Krenko, putting a counter on him and making 4 more goblins. Then Shawn takes 4 and Bilal takes 5. Shawn plays a swamp and casts Portal of Lunacy, revealing a permanent from his hand in his upkeep, then putting it into the graveyard if any opponent pays life equal to its mana value, or, if nobody does, he puts it into play instead. Jason plays an Exotic Orchard and casts Incubation Druid, then also casts Glorfindel Dauntless Rescuer. After that, he casts Elrond of the White Council, letting each player secretly vote for Fellowship or Aid when he enters the battlefield. Then Jason gains control of a creature chosen by each person who voted Fellowship, and puts a +1/+1 counter on each of his creatures for each Aid vote. This ends with me voting for Fellowship, giving Jason a Goblin token, while everyone else votes for Aid, so he puts 3 +1/+1 counters on all of his creatures. He moves to combat and attacks Bilal with Elvish Mariner, scrying 1, putting a +1/+1 counter on Elrond of the White Council, tapping Kalain, and then doing 6 damage to Bilal. In Bilal's upkeep, he puts 2 counters on Descent into Avernus, letting everyone make 2 treasures, but also doing 2 damage to them. He then taps Mere Convert, paying 2 life to make a black mana, and casts Doomsday, searching his library and graveyard for 5 cards, exiling the rest, putting those 5 cards back into his library in any order, and losing half his life rounded up. Then he's able to tap Rowan to make all his black and red spells cost 16 less this turn, and this lets him cast Bolus's Citadel so he can cast the top card of his library by spending life rather than mana. With that, he casts Overmaster from the top of his library, making his next spell unable to be countered and drawing a card. Once that's resolved, he casts Claim the Firstborn from his library, untapping Rowan, tapping her again to make his spells cost an additional 18 less to cast. This lets him cast Crackle with Power for X equals 11, doing 55 damage to each opponent, knocking us all out, and winning Bilal the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely very short. We actually wrapped things up on turn 5, so a very quick game. Overall, I want to say it was about 20-25 minutes total, so you only got to see obviously the 5 minutes of it, but if you're interested in the full 25 minutes, you can join us as a patron or channel member. Both of those will give you access to the full unedited gameplay. But overall, I think everyone's deck really did a little something, unfortunately, except for maybe Shawn's. But we'll talk about that one. Our deck, I think, did very well. We actually had Krenko in our hand, the one that can tap to make a ton of mana, not the one that was already on the board. So we were really about to do a ton of damage if we were able to untap. And based on Bilal's board at the time, I think he would have been our primary target, being that he couldn't block and or kill most of our goblins. So he is very lucky that he won the game on that turn, because there is a chance I would have knocked him out on my turn. So I'm very impressed by Muxus. Even though we didn't cast Muxus himself, the goblins still did very well and felt very strong. Moving along to Shawn's Gork deck. Like I said, he really unfortunately didn't get a chance to play a ton. He only really cast 3 or 4 spells and didn't do too much. I'm hoping that he can bring the deck back. I know he's talked about trying to tweak it and improve it, so I'm very excited to see what it can do if we ever see it again. And then Jason's deck, also very powerful. He was starting to get quite a few synergies on the board. A lot of elves that cared about scrying and did things when he scryed, whether it was tapping creatures, putting counters on things. So very, very impressive. I think that if he had had a couple of turns to set up, maybe if he'd had a counter spell for something Bilal was doing, I think he probably could have closed out the game very quickly. So a very impressive showing by him as well. And then, of course, moving on to Bilal, our champion of this video, did very well. Rowan was very, very impressive. I think one of the things that really caught my attention with Rowan was the fact that he used Claim the Firstborn to gain control of Rowan and then untap her and give her haste because she technically cost less than 3, which was not something I would have thought about doing. So it was very, very impressive. And being able to make all of his stuff cost essentially like 36 mana less to cast is absolutely terrifying when you think about the number of X spells that black and red have. So very, very cool. I'm sure we'll see that deck again, and I'm interested to see how it goes without the Doomsday. I'm not saying that I want to see it specifically without it, but I would kind of like to see Rowan's long game. I'm very interested to see how it performs later in the game. But overall, let me know what you think of the deck. Let me know what you think of our opponent's decks. Let me know what you thought about the game. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.